centrist position.
Now, Shashi, how can I compete with this huge fan audience of yours? But I'm going to try. And this is meant to be a conversation, so I think we both have a go. I mean,
A little closer, I think, too.
Sorry?
Mic a little closer.
Closer? Okay. Now, I would like to, I know you want to talk, and I do too, about what the British did and didn't do for us. But I think the question we've been set is, did we really need the Brits? And I'd like to kick off that by saying I probably would agree with you, to your surprise, that I don't
That is my surprise.
Yes, I don't think we really did need the Brits. But I have to say a big however. I think India, pre-colonial India, was a basket case. The economy was in decline according to all the independent figures, and I can quote you Indian economists, from 1600 onwards, from the end of Akbar's reign onwards. Mughal agriculture was stagnant, surplus was taken by jagirdars, there was nothing to reinvest. Indian exports were already declining. Education was non-existent. There were no universities. Schools were in a dreadful state. Read Aparna Basu, the education historian. And so I think on all these indicators, plus the Mughal state had collapsed because of a series of invasions from the Marathas, from Nadir Shah, from Ahmad Shah Abdali. So there was a huge political vacuum which was affecting the economy. So this was the pre-colonial situation in the 1750s. And I have to say that, you know, my criticism of the Brits, apart from their racism, which I would join you in criticizing, is that they didn't do enough. They were not here to transform India. They were not here to modernize India. Whatever they did was incidental initially to their commercial project. And nevertheless, I think they did more good than harm. Now, over to you.
No, well, I mean, that's where Zareer and I disagree. Now, the portrait he paints of India in the mid-18th century is not quite the whole story. India was, despite some of these things being correct, that is that agriculture was relatively stagnant and the later Mughals were quite rapacious through their system of tax collection through the jagirdars and so on, but India was a sophisticated economy with a significant merchant banking system. It is estimated that the Jagat Seths in the 1750s, who helped finance Clive, by the way, actually dealt with more money in the course of the year than the Royal Bank of England. And this is at the time that Zareer is talking about. As to exports going down, depends on which exports. Textiles continue to go up. There's a very substantial paper, which I have, you can find in my endnotes, by a research scholar who specializes in precisely this, that gives you details of the value of textile exports.
Tirthankar Roy at the LSE?
Exactly.
Yeah, he says Mughal trade exports were declining before the British arrived.
Well, we're going to have to look at the numbers and compare them. But there is no doubt that we're talking about a relatively prosperous and complex society with artisans, with weavers, with exporters, merchants, shipbuilders, sword makers, all of these, so that not everyone was dependent in any case on the relatively stagnant agriculture, and that the agriculture itself did not, for example, involve landless peasantry. People lived on the land that they tilled and had a sense of ownership of it, even though they may have had to pay rapacious taxes. And as far as the overall economy was concerned, it may not have been an entirely egalitarian system, but as of 1700, 27% of global GDP, and as late as 1800, 23% of global GDP, citing figures from the Oxford econometric historian Angus Maddison. So on that, I think
also have Madison's figures.
There you are.
And they don't add up, I'm afraid. Don't add up to yours.
The point I'm trying to make is that to suggest that the Brits came into some sort of basket case country is laughable. There is absolutely no evidence to sustain that.
Can I quote Irfan Habib to you? Would you take his? He says the Mughal Empire was its own gravedigger. No new order was or could be created by the forces ranged against it either. And this, is from a very reputed historian of the Mughal
very much
period.
So, but no new order could have been created is speculative counterfactual history, and I'd say that any one of us can come up with a counterfactual. The Marathas, for example, had made considerable progress. Yes, they got a walloping by Ahmad Shah Abdali at the Third Battle of Panipat, but then Abdali went away again.
And the Marathas didn't build a single institution, civil society. They levied chauth, which was a form of blackmail, protection money.
And you're not going to get me on stage attacking the Marathas in Mumbai. His address is available somewhere else.
Why not? Why not? We are not still under the heel of the Shiv Sena here. Now, but I think, you see, the whole problem with this argument is, let's not get into counterfactuals, let's look at factuals. And the factuals are on all the best economic statistics, and I refer you to Tirthankar Roy, I refer you to D.N. Gadgil, the first chairman of one of the chairman of our planning commission, which suggests that Indian manufacturers did not suffer significantly under the British. There was a slight dip in the 1820s. They picked up with cheap yarn, etc. By the 1850s, we were competing with Lancashire. By 1947, we had the world's fourth largest textile industry, supplying 78% of India's textile needs. These are all there,
Yes, indeed. But the fact is that the high-quality textile industry the British destroyed was destroyed. There are statistics, for example, showing that Murshidabad and Dhaka became the first cities in the modern world to be actually depopulated. They lost population.
Centers
and
moved.
The weavers thrown out of work were then flung into farms which could not support them.
Why would the East India Company throw weavers out of work? The East India Company was here to export Indian textiles to Britain, right? They were not Lancashire mill owners. Why would they be putting weavers out of work? They wanted weavers.
Well, I should think that what they wanted to do was to sell whatever goods they were bringing into India.
They were not bringing any cloth into India.
And they did? Of course they did.
No, they were not. The cloth import started in the 1820s,
yes.
And it was not, they were manufactured by Lancashire mills, which had nothing to do with the East India Company. The East India Company didn't manufacture goods.
The East India Company was a trading company, but there was a bias towards trading for the British. I mean, let's face it, for example, if you take something like the shipbuilding business, what happens is the Indians are making these wonderful ships, essentially using teak and mahogany, which lasted longer than fir and pine, which is what European ships were made of. The average European ship didn't last much longer than 6 or 7 years. The average Indian ship lasted a good 24, 25 years. So when the East India Company establishes its dominance over the ports, the Brits say, hey, great, let's make ships in India. Better for us. So the British companies come and they start making ships in India. And there's wonderful accounts, some of which I've quoted, of the high quality of Indian craftsmanship, not just the woodwork, but the brass and fixtures and fittings and so on. What's the consequence? It throws people out of work in London. Shipwrights, blowwrights, dockyard workers, unemployed. Now, the East India Company may not be in the shipping business, but when this happens, what happens? The British Parliament passes a law that makes it impossible for ships made in India to ply the lucrative route to England. Promptly, shipbuilding in India collapses because nobody is able to make ships in India anymore, and Indian ships are essentially confined to the very, very small coastal trade between small Indian ports. In other words, the dice were constantly stacked against India. When Zareer talks about things like
sorry, Shashi, I have to come in there, because you say the dice were constantly stacked. I would agree with you about the 1840s and 50s. However, from...
the law I'm talking about was 1814.
No.
Soon after the Napoleonic Wars, 1817,
Yes,
I think
okay, but by the time you got to the 20th century, there was tariff protection for Indian industries, which Indian textile...
Oh, come on, the destruction of the attempt by Chidambara Pillai to start a shipping line is well documented. The British had no desire to see an Indian company in the shipping business. They drove him out of business.
Well, I have
and he ended up, poor fellow.
I don't have the statistics on shipping. However, I do have the statistics on textiles, which is one of the big examples you give in your book of deindustrialization.
Absolutely.
And I think there is no doubt that once the cotton mill started in Bombay with British capital and technical assistance, they grew rapidly. They were supplying 8% of domestic...
This is much later, Zareer.
Sorry?
This is much later.
Yes. And
because why? The Brits wanted cheaper Indian labor. You paid them less than you paid the guys in Lancashire. It's as simple as that. It's not a virtue.
I again refer you to Tirthankar Roy, who is the leading economic historian of this period. He's at the LSE, he's an Indian, he's a Bengali. Now, his view is that there is no question that through the early British period in India, there were winners and losers, but because cheap yarn actually helped weavers, it didn't help spinners. But in the long run, he argues that textile prices came down, there was more demand for textiles, per capita consumption of textiles went up. This is in the 1820s and 30s, and there was more demand for the products of weavers. So by the time you get to 1947, there were as many weavers in India as there were in 1757.
By 1947, the fact that Indians had, in fact, established textile companies, not just in Bombay, Ahmedabad, and so on, is absolutely documented. But as I say,
no, I'm talking of handlooms. The handloom sector, in absolute terms, was as big as independence as it was when the British took over.
You still can't deny the fact that it went through a terrible dip between roughly the 1760s, 1770s, the incident that Robert Bolts, the Dutch observer, recorded of the weaver's thumbs being cut off.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. I want to take you up on that because
I know the British keep saying it never happened, but I have an account.
No, it's not the British. I have taken the trouble, having seen that in your book, to get William Bolt's book out of the London Library. It's a wonderful 18th century book. It was written by a Dutch trader who was expelled by the East India Company for black marketing diamonds. He then wrote this monograph of every kind of rumor and allegation he could find. And even his book only says this was a rumor. And he doesn't say that the British cut off anyone's thumbs or broke them, as you claim in your book. He says weavers cut off their own thumbs. Which is, yes, I assure you, Shashi, on oath, that I have been to have you looked at the source?
Yes.
No, well, absolutely. I suggest you go back to it.
I haven't gone back to the Huntington Library in England or wherever, but I have actually seen a reprint of this, and that's not what it says. All right,
but it's even more improbable. Just ask yourself, why would Indian weavers cut off or break their thumbs rather than work for the British who were paying, if they were being paid the going rate?
Why did these poor weavers lose their jobs? Why did they leave Murshidabad and Dhaka?
There were more. It was spinners who lost their job. And the statistics, all the statistics, let us be clear, yours and mine, are guesstimates because there were no censuses done. There were these are what economists call qualitative statistics, not quantitative statistics, as you know.
But some statistics were kept. For example, the British kept rather meticulous accounts of the amounts of money they sent back to England each year.
Yes.
And that's documented and it's there. Let's agree to disagree on textiles and move on, because otherwise we'll have an entire conversation for Datta Samant and not about...
Did you want to move on? Did you want to move on to the so-called drain theory?
Yes, certainly. Dadabhai Naoroji has started the documentation of that. Yeah. And I'm sure you've read Digby's numbers.
Yes. And Dadabhai Naoroji
You see how well prepared Zareer has come with all his numbers on his laptop. And I have to trust my poor political memory.
Someone has to, rather than rely just on emotions. And I think the point about the drain theory is, if you look at the inward investment that came in from Britain, it was £312 billion in 1913. the interest payments on that would have worked out at 3.5% or 4%, which was the global rate of interest, would have been far above.
Where do you get these numbers from,
remittances.
Zaid?
The numbers, because Shashi,
What do they bring money in to invest? Where is the evidence of their investment?
There was huge investment coming in. You don't look at it. There was a lot of investment coming in.
Well, there wasn't.
I'm sorry.
I mean, the fact is not only that the British extracted taxation at a rapicious rate, far worse than the Mughals, and that they sent it all back to Britain.
Absolutely wrong there.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Even the worst and most oppressive local Rajas built bridges and sarais and roads. The Brits didn't. This is all documented in British accounts, and I've cited many of them, but I've also read extensively, till my eyes started blurring, accounts of the British flagellating themselves about their failure to do these things. There are books available published in the late 18th and early 19th century. But let me briefly finish the counter riposte to what you just said. Not only did the British yeah, you must follow Zareer's advice.
More emotion, less facts.
So
we have an intelligent audience.
So not only did do I find absolutely no evidence for any significant British investment in India, but for example, it is a documented fact that India was the principal contributor, for example, to the British war effort in the First World War. At exactly the time that Zareer is talking about, the British weren't sending money to India, they were extracting money from India.
No, that's
from
not
the Indian
true.
taxpayer,
Have you
looked at Absolutely, I have
looked at the fact of what the government of India was getting for the service of Indian troops abroad? Do you know that in 1947, India was left with 37 billion pounds of foreign reserves, which were payment for the services of Indian troops abroad in World War II. I don't have the figure for World War I.
I do have the figure for World War I. Look them up in my book.
Okay, but can I just take you up on the tax system? Because I am quoting Madison, whom you quoted earlier. He says, the British inherited the Mughal tax system, which provided a land revenue capital equal to 15% of national income. By the end of the colonial period, land tax was reduced to only 1% of national income. Mughal land tax was about 30% of the crop. But by 1947, land tax was only 2% of agricultural income.
You're talking 1947. I'm talking about the 1770s. I'm talking about the 1780s. I have documentation of taxes being as high as 85 and 90% of the crop.
Well, P.J. Marshall, whom you quote in your book, says the opposite. He says the British were very conservative. They kept the Mughal land revenue taxes.
No, there were large chunks of Bengal, for example. We have evidence of peasants actually fleeing company-controlled lands for lands still ruled by Indian princes because they were more humane.
And what was the evidence?
It's the numbers of people moving. That's the evidence.
Where'd you get that from?
From documents I read from that period. Some of which, by the way, was submitted to the House of Commons in testimony as well. And I don't just mean the Burke impeachment speech against Hastings. I actually mean hearings in the House of Commons both in the 1780s and 90s, but as late as the 1840s. There's some startling testimony by former British civil servants about the way in which Britain was running the Indian Empire, given to British legislators, MPs listening to them, which is truly damning. And again, I've quoted some of it, but for every bit I've quoted, there are 10 things more equally damning about the way in which the British conducted themselves. I think
does that not say something for the self-critical faculties of British officials? And I mean, I think since we're not going to agree on the economy, and neither of us has the economist we want here to back
Angus
us up,
Madison is in the grave, alas.
Let's move on to, shall we move on to political, educational, more institutional things?
Yes.
Now,
yes.
On the political side, can you question the fact that the British did introduce, however belatedly, they introduced municipal self-government from the 1860s. They introduced provincial autonomy from 1937 with 1/6 of the adult population voting.
And how late was that by comparison with what they gave to the so-called white Commonwealth?
I'm not.
No, I mean,
I said at the beginning there was racism.
There was total racism.
There was also the problems of a largely illiterate society, and I think we come on.
That's not the point. You're not looking at empowering. You're not making an illiterate peasant into the governor or the municipal mayor. You're looking at example after example of educated, qualified Indians who were discriminated against, denied opportunity. When they were reluctantly admitted to the service, they were drummed out of it, they were denied serious positions, and I've gone into this in some detail. And again, the British condemned themselves in their own mouths. You've got Lord Lytton, Queen Victoria's favorite poet, Robert Bulwer Lytton, Viceroy of India, at her own request, writing to her saying, you know, we've seen your proclamation in which you say you want to associate Indians with governance, and of course we are following this and hiring some Indians. But you do realize, don't you, that we can't give them any real authority. And these are people who are in many respects far more qualified than the mediocre Englishmen who are given real authority, but who happen to be white.
Shashi,
there's simply no excuse for this.
No, I quite agree. And I said at the beginning that I thought one of the blemishes on the Raj, and a major blemish.
But it infects everything.
It did, and it led to an independence movement which reversed that. There was, however, I think you will accept, a process of Indianization which began after World War I, both of the armed forces and of the ICS.
And why? Because at World War I, the surplus population of available young men to run the empire got killed in the trenches of France and Europe, and suddenly they needed to actually associate non-whites with the process of government. If the British hadn't lost so many available young men in the First World War, they'd have continued ruling India as oppressively and as racist a way as they had done for the preceding century.
I think that's a very cynical view, because I think...
It is a cynical view because the experience of British rule breeds cynicism.
Again, you can't prove a counterfactual, and I can't prove you wrong on that. It's hypothetical. The fact is they did introduce Indianization.
They did
introduce democratization.
And what did they do at the end of the First World War? They introduced the Rowlatt Acts. They introduced the repressive Rowlatt Acts, in which they actually, having broken their promise to give Indians responsible self-government in return for their support in the First World War, they introduced the repressive Rowlatt Acts, restricted assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, everything, arrested people, cut down on demonstrations, all of that, and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre followed. So you cannot tell me that associating Indians after the First World War was what the Brits did.
Look, I mean, Jallianwala Bagh involved maybe, is it 400 people killed and...
No. 1379. Come on, don't give me this.
Okay, well, Shashi, you have your own sources and your own figures. I'm not going
there's a detailed commission of inquiry conducted
No historian, the inquiry produced, I think it was...
That was the Hunter Commission, gave you 400. The Congress Party's inquiry named the 1379 people.
I think it was appalling. I think the British have apologized for it. I think it was...
No, they haven't apologized for it. But they have never apologized. And they should. I have demanded in Britain that Britain should take the opportunity of the centenary. The centenary of the massacre comes up on the 13th of April 2019, and I hope that by then we will have an apology from somebody in a responsible position.
And will the Congress Party apologize for how many thousands killed in Kashmir, for 100,000 Muslims killed in invasion of Hyderabad?
I think that...
How many? According to Saeed Naqvi, 100,000 Muslims killed in Nehru's invasion of Hyderabad. Are you going to apologize for that?
No, because that was a war. Jallianwala Bagh was a massacre.
A war.
The Razakars were armed to the teeth. And they were, I'm sorry, that was a military
Kashmir
action.
Wasn't a war. Kashmir was a walkover, was it?
I didn't say Kashmir wasn't. Did I say Kashmir is a walkover? Did somebody hear me say that?
But look, can we go to something a bit more structural? Which is take the rule of law. When the British arrived, a Brahmin could not face the death penalty if he killed a Shudra. A Shudra was facing the death penalty if he cohabited with an upper caste woman. At least give the British the credit for introducing equality before the law and not recognizing castes as having different status under the law.
Oh, well, let me stress the one major caste that the British did recognize was the caste that they belonged to. The rule of law was implemented with excessive deference to the skin color of the defendant. So in 200 years of British rule, there are only 3 cases in which Englishmen were convicted for murdering Indians, while thousands of Indians were actually killed. whereas any Indian who so much as raised his hand against an English person was liable to being hanged, to being blown from the mouth of a cannon, or the mildest punishment was being transported off to the Andamans. So don't tell me about the rule of law in Britain, in British India. Indian judges were not allowed to try English defendants in most parts. In fact, when the Ilbert Bill was passed, the poor Viceroy Ripon, the one non-racist Viceroy we had, was drummed out of office and driven back home.
That was in the 1880s.
Yes,
the British were there for another half century.
Yes, but for another half century, the practice continued.
No, it
I have
didn't,
quoted
didn't,
an incident from 1926 of this kind of racist thing. The British evolved this entire theory of the so-called Indian spleen, which is that
Shashi,
all Indians were malarial, they had enlarged spleens, so when an Englishman kicked an Indian to death by kicking him in the stomach, it wasn't the kicker's fault, it was the fault of the ruptured
That was
spleen.
one case, yes, and
No,
it's
not
much
one
quoted.
case,
But
I'm sorry, there were literally
But can I give you
dozens
the example of
Don't
thousands?
talk to me of rule of
Can
law,
I
there
give
was no
you
rule of
the
law in the
example
British
of thousands of civil disobedience resistors in the Congress? My father was one of them, spent 4 years in jail, who did not get kicked, who were treated as my father's words, officers and gentlemen. They were kept in political prisons. They were allowed to have political meetings, get literature in. They constructed socialist and communist cells and came out and founded socialist and communist parties. All this was tolerated and indeed, often encouraged by British officials.
Yeah.
So is there anything positive you feel in the legacy? Or is, because surely, one thing that history teaches us, and is that nothing is ever totally black and white. And there has to be a bit more than cricket and P.G. Wodehouse, which is all you seem to acknowledge.
All I acknowledge, exactly.
And your language.
And
your language.
So,
Zareer, the fact is that I do quote a lovely letter by Jawaharlal Nehru to Lord Lothian, responding to precisely the argument you make, in which he points out not just the daily humiliations that Indians were subject to, including Indians like Zareer's father and like Nehru himself. But as he says, essentially the fundamental lack of self-respect. There is, in fact, a serious question as to how do you weigh these things in the balance. There was, in fact, another anecdote I recount quite separately about the visit of Edward, the man who briefly became Edward VIII, later as Prince of Wales, to India, who spoke to the Indian official accompanying him and pointed to a number of what he saw as wonderful things, buildings and trains and so on and so forth. And he said, so we've given you all of this, what is lacking here? Whereupon the Indian official responds, self-respect, Your Majesty, or whatever, Your Highness. And that is the key issue. I mean, the ultimate thing is that...
it came peacefully. It came through peaceful evolution.
I'm very sorry to interrupt, but we are just left with 10 minutes. Would you like to go with the Q&A session?
So,
yeah, let's get some questions.
Open it up, the lady in front
we
here.
just have 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please calm down. We'll try to do the best. Please calm down.
I think you better decide whether we take questions or not. No. Okay.
All right, carry on.
So, okay. So we carry on. Shashi, I want to come on to something like education because we touched on language.
Zareer, I gather you've given an entire talk on the subject of British education in India.
Okay. And I know you think there wasn't any, but...
there was very little of it. There was very, very little of it.
But...
in 1930, the entire education budget of British India, at all levels, from kindergarten to university, put together, amounted to a little over half of that of the high school budget of the state of New York. This is according to Will Durant, the American historian who was traveling here at that time.
Yes,
the Brits
and Will
had
Durant,
no interest in spending money on Indians.
Will Durant, whom you use in your book, is not considered a historian by any historian I know.
Well,
he wrote for coffee table books for society women in Bombay in the 1950s. He was virulently anti-British, and no one else, no one other than you quotes him.
Well, I'm delighted to quote him because I think his information is considerably well substantiated. And this kind of figure can easily be verified. I quote him I didn't go and look up the high school budget of the state of New York. But the fact is the Brits had no real interest in educating Indians. They weren't particularly keen on spending money for the well-being of Indians. Macaulay made it clear, Zareer has written an entire biography of the man, that the interest was in creating a class of Indians. What was it? Indians in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions
And
and
can
morals
I
and
can I
intellect.
can I
And
quote?
the purpose of
Can
those
I
people
quote?
was
And
to
can I
serve
quote?
as interpreters between the British and the people.
No,
who were
no, no,
governing.
no. Can I quote Macaulay's next sentence, which people like you ignore? To that class we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science taken from the Western nomenclature, and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for carrying knowledge to the great mass of the population. And if you read Macaulay's other writings, he saw India as moving towards self-government, admittedly through Western education filtering down, and the filtration theory didn't work, and it was reversed under Curzon and people like that who said it wasn't working. But I think, on the figures, I have to tell you that literacy, and this was an argument Gandhi had with Sir Philip Hartog, a British educationist. And Gandhi made a speech at Chatham House, similar to yours, sort of excoriating everything in the Raj, and he said literacy has declined, and Philip Hartog sent the census figures to him from 1880 onwards, showing not spectacular, but steady increase. And if you look, male literacy went from 8% in 1881 to 30% in 1947. Female literacy went from virtually 0 to 9% in 47.
8.8,
very, very poor. But, it took India till 2009 to create free and compulsory primary education. So we can't blame the British for failing to do that. Yes, they were a laissez-faire state.
They didn't try.
They didn't, but neither did India till
India did. India
2009.
did much larger numbers of people. The Brits, at the peak, only had 300 million Indians to contend with as late as the 1940s, and still they didn't spend the money that would have been required to educate them. Now, I think it's very difficult to put lipstick on this particular pig. I mean, this is really a policy that systematically spent the least conceivable amount of money for the welfare of Indians, where every institution and every single contribution the British made was actually directed towards enhancing British profit, perpetuating British control, and promoting British interests.
But
Indians were totally irrelevant to the enterprise, except that we happen to be here.
Okay, if you accept the Madison figures, they show that India had a more or less steady rate of growth under the Raj, with a slight dip in the 1820s of 1.5%. That was the average.
And from 1900 to 1947,
it
was 0.01%.
Yeah, because there happened to be a world recession. But I'm saying the average rate over the entire period was 1.5%, corrected for population growth. That was the rate of growth under Nehru's government, and it was till 1980, 1.5%. People used to call it the Hindu rate of growth.
3 actually, but still. Yeah,
No, not corrected for population. 3 without population growth, 1.5% allowing for population. So I really think you have to see this in the context of what came before and what came after. And I think we have to agree to disagree, because I think there was some progress. It was not as great as it should have been. It certainly, was filling a political vacuum, which might have resulted in several states emerging. And if you compare India's performance with China's over the same period, and China did not have colonial rule, at least not in any indirect sense, China's performance was much worse. China's industrial output fell by 10% by 1913. And then they had civil wars, and then they had Mao.
Yeah, they had a different history at that time, and they did have, the country was divided, fragmented, warlordism. They did have large chunks of the country.
Which was happening in India.
Captured by the colonialists as well. I mean, Beijing was essentially divided amongst half a dozen colonial powers, so were large chunks of the South. So it's a different story, and I don't think we should compare China to India. As far as Indian growth is concerned, I will take this precise argument you made about 1900 to 1947 when you said there was a recession. Fair enough, there was a recession for part of that time, from about 1929 to about 1938. The fact still
Right
is...
through from the end of World War I, global trade was declining.
I know, my dear boy, just take the entire 47 years and tell me what the British rate of growth was, tell me what the American rate of growth was. How is it that other countries could grow, but thanks to the tender mercies of British rule, India didn't grow?
No.
I mean, the fact is...
According to Madison, it grew by 1.5%, which
1900
was in line...
0.01%.
No, that's
You
not...
can check,
those are not Madison's figures, I'm sorry.
You can check the numbers, correct them for
I will
population growth,
check
and that's what
them.
you'll find.
No, 1.5% per capita income increase, not the GDP increase, which
I'm talking GDP because that's the overall number one can find.
GDP divided by population gives you per capita.
The point is, I am arguing that the Brits ruled India in the interests of Britain, not in the interests of Indians. And I think that case you have not refuted.
When you say the Brits, you're clubbing together a lot of people, some of whom were very idealistic. If you read their private papers, you read their diaries, people like Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who was responsible for Elphinstone College here.
Well, he was also responsible for the divide and rule theory. So,
this divide and rule theory, which you feast on, Shashi, there is not a single jot of evidence for it anywhere. Give me a single quotation.
Elphinstone's own memorandum,
Yes.
1858, Divide et impera was the ancient Roman maxim, and it shall be ours, quote, unquote.
And which Elphinstone are you referring to? Not Mount Stuart Elphinstone.
Well, the Elphinstone who was around...
Mount Stuart Elphinstone was here in the 1820s. 1858, in
there
the
there
immediate...
was an Elphinstone in the Bombay presidency.
Yes, there was a Lord Elphinstone who was a descendant who was governor of Bombay.
That's the one I'm referring to.
No one took him very seriously.
Oh, come on.
No, he was not.
Zareer's technique is anybody I agree with is taken seriously. Anybody I don't like is not taken seriously.
Context. He was talking in the immediate context of the mutiny or the War of Independence or whatever. When the British had a tremendous, for a few years, it didn't last more than a decade. There was a decade of feeling, they had to entrench themselves. They were about to be driven out. They became very defensive. But there is no evidence that...
it continues. I mean, look at the partition of Bengal. It was deliberately and consciously conceived as a ploy to divide Hindus and Muslims. It was projected as such. There are speeches by the Lieutenant Governor, Bamphil Fuller, saying that the entire purpose of this was to give Mohammedans control over their own territory in East Bengal for the first time, and how between his two wives, Hindu and Muslim, he preferred the Muslim. All of this talk was deliberate. The classic story of the Nawab of Dhaka, Oxonian, who told about the plan to partition Bengal, says, this is a beastly idea, I shan't stand for it. And the Brits quietly slip him £100,000, and suddenly he sings a different tune.
No,
this is the way in which the Brits consciously pursued divide and rule.
But, Shashi, then you have to also give them credit for reversing the partition of Bengal, which they did in a few...
massive protests for 3 years.
Under
made the place ungovernable.
So they listened to protest, which is something, our independence...
You asked me to demonstrate proof that there was divide and rule. I gave you proof, another said there was, but they reversed it.
It wasn't the dominant policy. Let's put it that way.
It was very, very much deliberate, minuted policy.
Check.
Anyway, I mean, the partition of Bengal...
Partition of Bengal, no Bengali I know would like to reverse it, either in Bangladesh...
at that time they did, didn't
they? But not in 1947, unfortunately, and not now. So you have to accept that there were some structural differences between what, Muslim elites wanted and what Hindu elites wanted.
And who encouraged these divisions as a matter of policy?
You say, but there were many examples I can give you where the British brought them together and said, you must knock heads, you must work together, you must cooperate.
After they'd done all the damage in the first place. No, I mean, the British essentially helped create the Muslim League, and then to say 30 years later, you should cooperate is a bit hypocritical.
I think you really have very little respect for Muslims.
If
you think that the British... if you think
Now,
the
when
British...
will my BJP critics say this?
The
right?
British created the Muslim League. This argument, is very totally offensive to a lot of Muslims I know, because you treat them as children who were manipulated by the British. You don't accept that there were escalating communal tensions in a system where democracy was being introduced and people were contesting elections. And as happens now, increasingly trying to win votes on religious platforms.
So when people contest elections, the British decide deliberately to create electorates on communal lines. The British say that,
the British didn't decide this.
Would they in London have said that the Jews of Golders Green could only vote for Jews?
No.
I'm sorry.
But you're wrong. They didn't say. And I've come back on this example you give is totally wrong, because it suggests that Muslims were only allowed to vote for Muslims. What you ignore is that Muslims demanded and got a small proportion, of reserved seats, in which Muslims only voted for Muslims. The vast majority of general seats were open to everyone, including Muslims, to vote in, and Muslim candidates and voters ran in those seats. So the argument that the British created these separate electorates, the Muslims demanded it, it was a guarantee of a certain minimum representation. If they were not stopped from voting in general seats, and they did.
They were not stopped from voting in general seats. In other words, but the whole idea of creating the separate seats was to foment a consciousness that your interests were best protected through your religious identification.
And Muslims had no say in that. Muslims had no. Syed Ahmad Khan had no say in that.
Right up to the 1920s, there were Muslims who simultaneously, in one case in the same year, presided over the Indian National Congress and presided over the Muslim League. In other words, they saw no incompatibility between the overall goals of the Indian National Congress.
Provided they had their reserved separate electorate. That was on that basis. It was agreed by the Congress. The Congress Muslim League Pact
It was agreed the
that.
Lucknow Pact of 1916, but the fact is that by that point, it became inevitable. From the Minto-Morley reforms onwards, these wretched separate constituencies were created. You can create a constituency and encourage people to think differently along those lines, because unfortunately, that is the way in which human beings are willing to take whatever opportunities are given along the ways that you can. In India, for example, the adoption of the Mandal Commission report by VP Singh's government created an incredible consciousness of the OBC community, of themselves as a community, entitled certain rights and privileges, and now you've got other communities, the Patels in Gujarat, the Jats in Haryana, the Marathas here, wanting to be classified as OBC. So are you going to say that...
That is rather different from,
No, it's not. It's the same
some protection
I don't think that
of
Muslims
minority rights.
So in 1857, when the Muslims and the Hindus fought side by side under the banner of the poor enfeebled Mughal emperor to overthrow the Brits, was there no separate religious consciousness?
It's such a loaded... The Muslims and the Hindus, there was... 1857 was dispossessed elite. Some Hindus, some Muslims, the Nana Sahib, the poor Mughal emperor wheeled out against his will. There was no question of a Hindu-Muslim...
All I'm saying is it did not... There was absolutely no credible evidence that there was a separate, distinct Muslim consciousness versus Hindu consciousness politically until the British fomented
No, I have to totally disagree with you on that, and I think most Muslims that I know would, and had that, if your view, had it not been for your majoritarian view, we might not have had partition, because unfortunately, your view was also the view of Nehru, Patel, and Gandhi, who made it impossible to have a compromise with Jinnah.
No, the compromise
which the British would have loved.
The compromise that Jinnah wanted, that Zareer is implying, I think he's referring to, was the cabinet mission plan under which Jinnah would have retained the right to secede 10 years later anyway. So obviously there was no interest in agreeing to a plan that would have permitted not just a partition, but a far worse partition in which larger chunks of India would have had to secede.
Why?
So that's because the provinces, yes,
No,
the whole of Punjab,
still,
whole of Bengal, whole of Hyderabad, all grouped in these provinces. So no, we can discuss this unfortunately another time. I'm really sorry that I have a flight to catch. I have Parliament in Delhi tomorrow morning, so I won't be able to stay to sign books tonight. Thank you for being a great audience. Thanks, Zareer, for being such a good duelist, though I still disagree with you. And apologies for abandoning you at this time. Thank you.